For our virtual roadshow. It's been a long year. We actually were very lucky that we were able to get our roadshow in last year before everything shut down. So I definitely miss seeing folks face to face and being out in the communities. And I feel like we are finally seeing the light at the end of the tunnel as people get vaccinated. So I feel like we're going to be back in person very soon. So welcome to our virtual roadshow. We're going to talk a lot about the COVID impact on our children and some of the path forward. I also have here today with me Devontae Lewis from the Budget Project, who will be talking about some taxation policy and different forms of economic equity that are going to be coming up during this upcoming legislative session. So before I get started today, I just want to take a moment to sit in the remembrance of COVID-19 and the people who we've lost. It's been a very difficult year for, I think, every family in Louisiana. Either you lost someone, or you're grieving with someone who lost someone, or you know someone who suffered or continues to suffer to this day. So I just want to give some space for a moment to sit in that and let people remember that today. So today's meeting, we will talk about obviously the impacts on our children in these key areas: housing, access to food, the digital divide, health insurance, and childcare. Then we're going to look back a little bit quickly on the legislative session 2020 and forward to 2021, some of the things that are coming up this year. We're going to talk about the Family First Prevention Services Act, which is a big implementation that DCFS is working on right now. And DCFS has also put out a new safe haven video that I wanted to share with everyone today so that we can continue to get it publicized and shared throughout the state. So this is the first slide. This comes from our friends at the Louisiana Fair Housing Action Center. They estimate through these reports that 40% of COVID deaths would have been prevented had there been protections about eviction and utility disconnection in place from March through the end of November. 40% of COVID deaths would have been prevented. This is because people went into co-family situations, a lot of times often with older relatives. You had frontline workers moving in with older relatives that were at risk. And it created an environment where not only did COVID spread more rapidly, but it spread to the most vulnerable populations. And of course, as we know from the numbers, Black and Brown populations were disproportionately affected by deaths of under COVID-19. So the problem with the eviction crisis, though, is that it doesn't just end here with COVID. Yes, the state may get some funds to help people pay their back rent and get back into good standing on with their landlords. But if they were evicted because they lost their job during the pandemic, that's now on their credit record. So if they go to try to find another apartment, they may be denied housing even when they have the funds to pay for housing because this eviction is on their record. This story right here is a Zachary mother. Her name is Ariel Butler. She was evicted when she lost her job due to COVID-19, and her family, large family, lived in basically one room hotel room for quite a few days. I think over a series of months until they could find another place to live. They did have money. They could go find a place to live, but as they found out when they got into the market, they were being denied housing simply because they had been evicted. So this is something that's going to come to a head for us in many communities throughout the state. And so if you know of families that are facing this dilemma, Maxwell Cardullo at the Louisiana Fair Housing Action Center, this is his contact information. And he wants to make sure that you guys are aware that you can reach out to their organization so that they can start helping these families throughout the state recover from their eviction. It's going to be a terrible, terrible problem once all of the moratoriums are lifted, because we know that a lot more people are going to get evicted. So food insecurity was something that became very glaring during the COVID-19 crisis. I think it became much more evident just how much children being in school is what gives them food access. And when I say school, I also mean early care and education settings, because a lot of early care providers are what we call CACFP providers, where they use the federal program to feed the children that are in their care. So when daycare centers shut down, when schools shut down and went virtual, children did not have access to food. Now, some parishes in Louisiana were very proactive. They were packing food boxes. They were doing mobile meals. They were getting things as much as they could to kids. But many school districts were just overwhelmed by the concept of feeding kids in the virtual setting, and they just didn't do it at all in any form. So we started meeting with the Department of Education and brought to them the statistics. Before COVID, 1 in 4 Louisiana children lived in households that couldn't afford consistent access to nutritious meals. 1 in 4, and that was before COVID. 25% of children lived in families earning wages below the federal poverty line, and it was much, much worse for children of color. Black children, almost 50% of them lived in families below the federal poverty line. And so we knew that we needed to work with the department to work on this issue and help them connect CACFP providers, such as like the Second Harvest Food Bank or the 3 O'Clock Project, people who were already doing this work throughout the state, to these school districts that didn't feel like it was in their capacity to provide these meals. And we've learned a lot about the policy and some of the practices that have been going on at the state, and really started working with them and getting surveys of early care providers so that we can continue to keep track of who's able to serve meals and who needs some assistance. Very luckily, in March, our organization was awarded a grant by the Pew Charitable Trust to help the department build equitable policy statewide to increase the amount of food access for those kids from, of course, early care all the way to after school care, where we have the spectrum of children that are fed. So the Louisiana Budget Project, in conjunction with Feeding Louisiana, recently released a report called Summer Meals for Healthy Kids, and it details some proactive steps that policymakers can take. We're really going to take that report to heart and help push for those policies within the department so that we can increase food access. It's kind of a complicated issue because there's actually 3 agencies that touch food access for children. Of course, the Department of Education that handles it within the school settings. And then there's the Department of Children and Family Services that does the issuance of SNAP, including the pandemic EBT benefits that were issued last school year. And then, of course, we have the Louisiana Department of Health that does the sanitation permits for the people who actually prepare the food. So all of those pieces have to be moving in concert in order to keep the access to food open for children. And our policy, our sort of position throughout this process was, we don't want some sort of regulatory burden to be the reason a child isn't getting fed. And so we were trying to figure out how we could help open those doors and get those providers into the space where they could reach the children who are in need of food. So I'll just put this out. If your organization is seeing food access issues in your community, please, you can either put it in the chat right now, or you can reach out to me after the meeting. My email address will be at the end. We really want to talk with you so that we can look at the issue that's going on in your community and really address it with the resources that we have available. And I do notice that a few other people have joined us at this time. So if you're just now joining us, welcome. And if you could just put your name and your organization in the chat so that that'll serve as our sign-in sheet for today. So the digital divide, pandemic really opened up I think a lot of people's consciousness to the fact that broadband is not something that every family has here in Louisiana. And of course, this has been very stark as children have been in a virtual learning environment. It requires broadband to be able to do that. So we've done some research. Louisiana ranks 33rd in state broadband access. And let me be clear about what that means. State broadband access simply means that there is broadband available in that community. Doesn't mean it's affordable, doesn't mean it's accessible or sustainable for a low-income family. It just means that the actual infrastructure is there. Only 75% of Louisiana's population lives in an area with access to wired broadband. And again, we're not talking super high speed, we're talking the very minimum of what speed you can have and still be called broadband. 56.5% of Louisiana's population has access to wired low price broadband. So just over 50%. That means that almost 50% of the state does not have access to low price wired broadband. Telemedicine, as we've seen come up during the COVID-19 crisis, and of course, virtual school, they require broadband. So some people have been able to kind of limp along on their cell phones. We heard stories from Senator Mizell in Washington Parish where people would come and sit in the parking lot of her office, and she had her internet boosted so that people could come and sit in her parking lot and use the Wi-Fi at her office. And you're hearing other stories about children doing their schoolwork in the McDonald's parking lot because they had free Wi-Fi. This is really a stark disadvantage for children who are trying to maintain their education. You can see where low-income children would be essentially penalized for not having that access. In Louisiana, 17 parishes have 50% or less broadband coverage, and another 15 parishes have only 50 to 75% broadband coverage. And again, this is just coverage. This is not affordable coverage for families that have low income. Only 32 parishes in Louisiana have better than 75% broadband coverage. So here are our broadband deserts in the state of Louisiana. You can see they go from the absolute worst, Cameron Parish at 0.4%, to Wynn Parish, just over 50% at 50.1%. There's a great website here referenced and shows you the parishes and where the access is. And again, this is just a very minimum of broadband. If you want higher speeds, the deserts become even greater because there's just not the infrastructure for higher speeds for this communication. And there's so many things that are being done over the internet right now. I mean, this meeting right now is being done over broadband, and having that access in offices or in homes is really the big connection to the larger community. It's also the connection to commerce and enterprise that allows families access to information and other types of economic impact that they could use to lift their families. So this is a big issue. We're very happy that the state is going to be taking a lot of that CARES Act money and investing very specifically in this and getting this infrastructure built with the federal funds that have come down as a result of the pandemic. But this is a huge problem, and you can see right here, some of these parishes. I mean, LaSalle Parish, 6.5%. That is an incredible issue in the rural areas where they really are very much lacking that communication. So children's access to health insurance. This was an issue that started before COVID. And after we hit a historic low in 2017, the numbers of uninsured children started ticking up. So we have increased to 4.4% in 2019. And again, this was before COVID. And a lot of people are saying, well, 4.4%, that's not terrible. That represents over 50,000 children in Louisiana who don't have access to health insurance. And it's not because of income. We are seeing that some of the children are in fact eligible for CHIP programs, and they haven't been given that information, or they haven't been told that they are eligible for those programs. And then we have certain people who would be eligible for subsidies. And again, that information somehow is not reaching families. We estimate that COVID made this problem worse. We don't have the data yet, but as parents lost their jobs and they had that private pay health insurance through their employment, their children also lost that coverage. And the question is whether or not those parents were savvy enough to know that their kids were then eligible for CHIP at that point when they lost their jobs due to COVID-19. We have not seen the uptick in CHIP enrollment that would correspond to the folks that we believe have lost their health insurance coverage. So this is something we've been working with the Louisiana Department of Health on very closely. We had a resolution done during the second extraordinary session, so the October legislative session, to have them explore this and also reach out to the Department of Insurance to talk about all of the other access points for children and families accessing insurance. It's continuing to be an alarm. We've sounded the alarm, we're looking at the issues and continuing to focus on the policies that keep children insured. Now, having said that, health insurance is not healthcare. So that's only part of the puzzle. But we know that when children have access to health insurance, they're more likely to go to the doctor and get those preventive screenings and those vaccinations and other treatments they need to keep them healthy. So early care and education, tremendous impact as part of COVID-19. Sector-wide, the sector lost $245 million between March 2020 and January 2021. Louisiana's economy loses $1.3 billion a year, every year, due to childcare breakdowns. So when COVID hits, daycare centers had to close or reduce their size significantly in the early stages of the pandemic. And that caused, first off, an economic hardship for the child care centers themselves, but also an economic hardship or hardship for the families, where suddenly now the daycare that they've relied on, the child care that families have relied on was not there. So we've heard tons of stories about mothers who were trying to telework, do virtual school for an older student, and yet still take care of their younger child. It was a huge, huge impact as part of COVID. So the other side of the coin, of course, is the impact to the industry itself. Child care centers were on razor thin margins before COVID-19. And the closing and limiting of class size just made their economic picture that much worse. So as we talk about funds that are being infused into the childcare system because of the federal response to the pandemic, we're talking about stopping the hemorrhaging. We're talking about the money that's necessary to keep these businesses afloat so that they can continue to provide this vital service to families. That's not the money we need to stabilize the system and make it thrive going forward. And so that's where you hear that $86 million number that came from the Birth to Three report, the B2 Commission, to make seats available and really amp up the services that the early care industry does to the children of our state. And it's going to take innovation. It's going to take workforce development. It's going to take a lot of things to make sure that this system is sustainable into the future and can meet the needs of our communities. So we are asking for additional investment during the 2021 session. That is that $86 million number. They're looking at various forms of sources of that revenue, but we're really hoping that as the state moves around some of these federal funds, they can open up some state general dollars that will be available to shore up this system. So 2020 had 3 sessions. We started out with the regular one in March. It was shut down about 3 weeks into session, and we didn't meet until May. And of course, at that point, there wasn't enough time in a lot of people's estimation to get the budget through. So we finished that regular session and went directly into a special session in which they agreed on a budget and talked some about the COVID-19 response. And then we had another session that came up in October. It was ostensibly to deal with the federal funds that were coming from stimulus, but at that point, we actually hadn't gotten a lot of the federal funds that we have now. So a lot of the things that were decided in that session were without the knowledge of the money that was coming, and certainly not with the last set of payments that came down earlier this month. So in those 3 sessions that we had last year, there were 468 acts signed into law. Most of them dealing with, a lot of them dealing with COVID, and some, general little cleanup matters, because most legislators sort of pulled their legislation from consideration because of the tightened schedule. And then, of course, in the subsequent sessions, they were limited to special calls. So legislation could not be taken up on issues that were outside of what was in those calls. So an odd year, certainly not the number of bills that we would have during a normal regular session year. And as we ponder that, we're going into the 2021 session, which is a fiscal session. So a fiscal session is a much shorter session, and each legislator is limited to 5 non-fiscal bills. So when you hear a legislator say, I'm out of bills, that means they have introduced their limit of 5 non-fiscal bills. Tax and spending bills are considered fiscal bills, so they can have unlimited numbers of those, but they cannot take up other issues, such as one of the bills that Senator Cleo Fields has introduced, and we're going to get to that list in a second, is to make kindergarten mandatory. That would be a non-fiscal bill. That's an example. Pre-filing ends on Good Friday, which is April 2nd at 5 p.m. We will be putting our interactive bill list together, and it will be behind the membership wall on our website throughout the session. So as things get added, you can see the status of things, and as they get pulled, you'll be able to see those in live real time. For our non-members, we'll be publishing that static list that we do every year on the Monday after Easter. So here are the bills that we know about already. We are working on a Pregnant Workers Fairness Act, which is to end discrimination and allow workplace protections for women who are pregnant in the workforce. We had some legislation last year dealing with the pandemic EBT benefits, and those are the benefits that were going to children who weren't getting meals at school. They were actually getting direct subsidy payments to their families. There were a lot of issues with the information sharing. There were a lot of issues with this on the federal level, because the feds only took into account the children that were in the K through 12, the school lunch program, and did not include the children in the CACFP, so the kids who were normally get meals at daycare centers or early learning centers and Head Starts, and also didn't take into account the children who normally get meals after school and snacks in those programs. So now that those programs have been included on the federal level, we're going to have another batch of payments that are going to be given out. The issue is in Louisiana is that the Department of Education is not allowed to share their data with any other agencies. So we have to extend this caveat that we put in to allow that information to continue to be shared so that we can get those benefits distributed to those families. We are doing a study resolution on home visiting with the goal of creating policy within the Department of Health to make home visiting universal. So we're starting with a study resolution to look at all of the evidence-based programs that are in the state, including things like nurse home visitors and the other programs that are in place, and see what is the model and what are some of the best models, and how much money will it take to make home visiting available to every family in Louisiana who has a child. The pink tax exemption is coming back. Folks who don't know what the pink tax is, that's the tax on diapers and feminine hygiene products. And we did a very slight local option on that pink tax 2 years ago. And so this will extend that local option to allow local municipalities to end that tax with the hope that perhaps while we're talking about revenue, we can make this a statewide measure where there will be no state tax on diapers and feminine hygiene products. Mandatory kindergarten, I just mentioned, so folks may or may not know this, but a child in Louisiana is not required to show up at school until they're 7 years old. This piece of legislation by Senator Cleo Fields would drop that age down to 5 and make kindergarten mandatory in the state of Louisiana. We're keeping our eye on some school discipline and juvenile justice bills. A couple of them have already been pulled, which is not a bad thing. And we're really watching some of these bills that are at risk for creating this school to prison pipeline that we're very concerned about. There is some adoption legislation. There's a bill by Representative Rick Edmonds that we're very concerned about that essentially criminalizes a woman changing her mind and not giving up her child for adoption. We're very concerned about the ramifications of that bill, so we're going to be watching that very closely. And then there's some literacy legislation out there that doesn't match the recommendations of the Early Literacy Commission that the Department of Education convened last year and the year before. So we're going to be paying attention to that legislation because we're very concerned about some of the things that that legislation puts into place. And then we're going to swing for the fences. So we are looking for, and this is again, in addition to the 86 million to stabilize early care and education, 66 million for these core areas of child development. So the first one is the Family First Prevention Services Act implementation for DCFS. They estimate that they need about $35 million to implement that. That'll allow them to draw down the additional federal funds to pay for that implementation. So that's 35 million. We are looking at $10 million for infant and early childhood mental health infrastructure. This has been a request of the Children's Cabinet Advisory Board for years. And so what we are proposing is that the money goes directly to the 3 medical schools in the state of Louisiana, directly to their psychiatry programs to work on building that infrastructure from the psychiatrists, from the psychiatry, child psychiatry arena, and then rolling it out further in future years with Medicaid funding. We're looking for $1 million for CASA, FENS, the Louisiana Parenting Education Network, that's LaPen, and a reboot of Prevent Child Abuse Louisiana. I think a lot of people would be surprised to learn that we do not have a Child Abuse Louisiana since it closed its doors a couple of years ago. And so we were looking for the funds that would be held by the Children's Trust Fund in order to help support that reboot. And then finally, it's a $20 million ask for school-based health records and upkeep. Right now in Louisiana schools, we have social workers that are doing mental health work for students. This is reimbursable under Medicaid. Unfortunately, we lack a good record system to do those applications for reimbursement. And then in the places where we are able to ask for reimbursement, the rate is reduced because we have social workers doing other things in schools, such as proctoring tests or doing lunch duty or things of those nature. What this money would do would be to create a system, train school districts and their personnel on using that system, and then increase the availability of social workers in the schools by training more to get them into the schools and limiting them to providing these mental health services for children. This would also benefit our school-based healthcare centers because they would be able to benefit from the increased Medicaid reimbursement rates as well. So that's our 66 million. I call it Route 66 for a highway forward for our kids to get those things funded for our children throughout the state. So there are some capital days coming up. Wednesday, April 14th is Black Maternal Health Day. That is going to be a virtual day. Tuesday, April 27th is CASA Day at the Capitol. Tuesday, May 4th will be Children's Day at the Capitol. We had originally scheduled it for April the 13th, but we really want to do an in-person event and we feel like it won't be safe on that day, but perhaps by May 4th, we will be able to do an in-person event because at that point, more people will be vaccinated by then. Wednesday, May 5th is Louisiana Anti-Hunger Day. That's a virtual event. And then Tuesday, May 18th is Early Education Day. So all of these events are coming up, and of course they could become virtual events based on where we are in the pandemic reporting at that point. So this is the flyer for Louisiana Anti-Hunger Day, and there's a registration link there. And of course, these slides will be posted at the end of this presentation, and they will also be mailed out to you in an email. There'll be a link in the email after this event directly done by the system. And then there's two upcoming meetings of interest. The Children's Cabinet, which is the full cabinet with the governor, meets on Tuesday, April the 6th at 10:30 a.m. That is a virtual meeting. And the Children's Cabinet Advisory Board meets on Tuesday, April 13th at 9 a.m. That is also a virtual meeting. So the next thing I want to talk about is the Family First Prevention Services Act. This is a dramatic way in dealing with the children that are in the child welfare system in Louisiana. So the first part of the program is more preventive services to help strengthen families and keep kids out of the child welfare system. We know that it is inevitable that children will be in the child welfare system no matter how many supports we put out there. So it changes the way that we take these kids into the child welfare system by focusing on family placements and getting away from the group care settings. As a matter of fact, under the federal legislation, group settings will essentially go away. You will not be able to put children in group homes unless it is a high quality residential treatment program that is necessary for their treatment. So they will be serving children at risk for entering or re-entering foster care, children from families where there's substance abuse issues, siblings of children that are already in foster care. We have some parenting youth that are at risk of having their children in the child welfare system, and children with psychological or behavioral health needs where the parents or caretakers need additional support. So these are the families that are going to be primarily served by this Family First Prevention Services Act. And so the services under the federal law that can be provided have to be trauma-informed, evidence-based preventive services. So they have to have mental health, substance abuse, treatment and prevention services, in-home skill-based parenting programs, and then navigator programs for kinship care. And I see that Mary Catherine Moffitt from the Nurse Family Partnership just chimed in the chat. Nurse Family Partnership, part of that home visiting, that is also part of the preventive services that will be allowed under this act. And so the big question for the state is, how do we implement that and provide their services, not just for the most at-risk families, but for every family so that they don't end up at risk. And again, emphasis on family-like placement settings, getting kids out of the group home setting, kinship care for foster programs, and Melanie, I see your hand, 1 second. Placements for parenting youth, supervised independent living for youth, and qualified residential treatment programs. So we do have we do have residential treatment programs now in Louisiana. It's going to be helping those programs make sure that they meet the new rigorous federal standards. So as an example, we have the Louisiana Children's Methodist Home System. They do a lot of that residential treatment, and it'll just be making sure that they're meeting all of the guidelines of the feds and giving them some support and services to ensure that they can do that. It will also include high quality residential placements and supportive services for victims of sex trafficking, which is a issue that we have here in the state of Louisiana. So finally, the Family First Prevention Services Act is underway. They're going to be doing an incremental implementation, and that's where that additional funding comes through. It does require additional funds from the state in order to draw down the federal funds. So it is a much different implementation than we've had in child welfare in the past. And so finally, they're asking for folks in the communities, if you want to help, if you want more information, if you want to help collaborate with DCFS through the programs that you work with and run, this is their contact information. They invite you to email them or go to their site for updates, and certainly reach out to them to be part of the collaborative system that makes this change in child welfare in Louisiana. And this is our list of resources. Again, these slides will be posted. I'm going to post the link in just a second in the chat. But these slides, all of these links are live, and you can go to all of these sites to get the information that was presented here today. And here is my contact information. That is the link to the page with the slides and the downloads of the handouts. And again, I will post that in the chat in just a moment. And I have a quick video to show you guys, which is the Safe Haven, the new Safe Haven video that folks are from DCFS are publicizing to increase awareness about Safe Haven. So here we go.
You want the best for your baby. This is not how you planned it. Fear for your life and what your child's life may be. You may feel like there's nowhere left to turn. Know that you have options for your baby's future. Louisiana's Safe Haven law protects vulnerable newborns and mothers in crisis. The National Safe Haven Alliance Crisis Hotline can provide support and resources to help you explore your options, including adoption and the Safe Haven process. Parents may dial 911 or confidentially surrender their newborn up to 60 days old to a Safe Haven site employee, and it's a legal, safe alternative. This is not abandonment. It's a trusted place with a better future for your baby. We open arms to surrendered babies, give them the best possible care, and secure nurturing adoptive homes. And it's 100% anonymous. For crisis support, resources, and parenting option information, call 1-888-510-BABY or visit louisianasafehaven.com.
So louisianasafehaven.com, that's where you can view this video. They also have a number of resources available here. You can request materials for your organization, posters and information that to be shared with the public. The goal, of course, is to limit the number of abandonments in Louisiana. We still have very few in Louisiana, but it is still something that happens. So we want to make sure that people are aware of the options to anonymously surrender an infant rather than just abandoning it in some location. And now it is my incredible honor to turn the floor over to Devontae Lewis from the Louisiana Budget Project, who will be talking about the budget in Louisiana and taxation policy. So Devontae, are you able to share?
I am. Let me, let's see.
There you go.
I think everyone can see it.
Yep.
Perfect.
Perfect.
Well, good morning, everyone. As Susan said, my name is Devontae Lewis, and I serve as the Director of Public Affairs and Outreach at the Louisiana Budget Project. I'm sure most of you know us, but in case you do not, we are a nonpartisan, nonprofit policy think and do tank that work on issues that affect low and moderate income families in the state of Louisiana. And we do that particularly through the lens of looking at our budget and taxes system to really eradicate poverty, to promote racial equity, and to allow all Louisianians to prosper. And that's kind of our objective and our goal. So today I'm just going to kind of give you an overview of where we stand, when it comes to our budget and taxes, what we may see this legislative session, and especially how the influx of federal dollars that Susan talked about in her presentation can truly impact the way that we handle poverty in the state. So I kind of want to start off with some notions. We know that a lot of times Louisiana is called a very poor state, but when we think about the resources that exist in our state, we can really call ourselves a rich state. We rank in the top 5 when it comes to production of natural gas and chemicals. We are in the top 2 when it comes to oil refinery, and we're number 1 when it comes to our ports. And so that tells you that there's a lot of infrastructure, there's a lot of business, there's a lot of commerce happening in the state of Louisiana. But we know the reality of this commerce does not match the reality of our people. Because we know in the state of Louisiana that we're pretty much what would we call a poor state. Our poverty rating is the second highest in the nation at 19%. We have the second highest rate of children living in poverty. 1/3 of all of our children in Louisiana live in poverty. A half of all Black children live in poverty. We have one of the lowest median household incomes, just barely creeping over $50,000 a year for the average household in the state. And we're also the 4th highest when it comes to income inequality, which is really strange for a state like ours, because the states that beat us are California, Massachusetts, New York, states with industries that would exacerbate the income inequality from the richest person to the poorest person. And for Louisiana to be one of those states at the top, even though our median household income is so low, showcases a system of unfairness that has existed for way too long in our state. So why is that the case? So we know during COVID-19, we heard a lot of conversations about essential workers and the people working on the front lines. And we recognize the need that they deserve to be paid what they are worth. But here's why Louisiana has such a low median household income and high income inequality. As you can see on this slide right here, this is a forecast of all of the jobs and where they exist in Louisiana. And as you can see up here, the 4 major industries, healthcare, retail, accommodation and food services, and educational services, make up the vast majority of our jobs. But as you can see by this line right here, as many of you are aware, the United Way's ALICE report, which says what is the basic level of income people need to survive. And you can see that almost all of the jobs in Louisiana, are where the cluster of jobs are, pay less than what ALICE would says a family of 4 needs to truly survive. So it's not the case that people in Louisiana aren't working. It's the case that people are working, but that we aren't paying them enough for the work that they do, because everyone is being underpaid and not eligible to survive in our economic status. So what does this kind of mean in terms of our budget? We often hear the conversation that Louisiana's budget is just growing out of proportion. We are spending way too much money and we can do more if we trim the fat, limited government, and made it smaller. And what this slide from the Legislative Fiscal Office showcases to us is that that's not actually true. Louisiana is really kind of in the middle level of when we are talking about expenditures as a percent of their GDP. So as you can see, in the late 90s, we were kind of at the top tier of the country, and then we had a slug in the beginning of the early 2000s, and now we are really kind of at the bottom. And when it comes terms of the expenditures to our percentage of GDP, so we are not, our budget is not out of whack with other states. It's actually lower. We're spending a lot less lower, which means when we're talking about poverty, children, income inequality, we can see that we actually have more room to do more work for people, and that's what government should be doing. So that always brings us, when we talk about our state budget, to the conversations about taxes. And we hear this often that, oh, my taxes are just too high in the state of Louisiana. Taxes are way too high. And we can say that, but oftentimes that argument about taxes are way too high are not really about the people that they should be about. And that's the lowest 20%, people making less than $18,000 a year. Currently, when you combine our personal income tax, property tax, and the sales tax that we pay when we go shopping, if you make less than $18,000 a year and you're in the lowest 20% of Louisiana residents, you're going to pay about 12% of your entire income in taxes. While if you are in the top 1% in Louisiana, making over $500,000 every single year, you're only paying 6.1% of your income in taxes. So Louisiana has a system that is built off of regressivity. And so what does that mean? Regressivity is the theory of where your tax system structures, where the poorer you are, the more you pay. When we should have what's called more of a progressive taxation system, where this chart would be the opposite direction, where the richer you are, the higher your bracket of taxes would be, versus the lower economic status you are, the higher your taxes bracket would be. So the means simply that the poorest Louisianians are paying double the amount of a tax rate than what you see from the richest Louisianians. And so what does that mean when we talk about racial equity? When we talk about the situation, we see here that Black Louisianians are actually overrepresented in Louisiana's lowest income households. So while we know Black Louisianians make up about 31% of the entire state's population, Blacks are making about 43% of the bottom 20% of Louisiana. So those individuals making less than $17,000 a year. So we're seeing that when we are talking about kind of racial equity, and we're talking about why Black children are living in poverty at a higher proportion. And as we mentioned earlier, 1/2 of Black children live in poverty. It's simply because their parents and their grandparents and their caretakers are stuck probably working in the fields that pay less than $17,000 an hour. And we got to remind ourselves, this is a minimum wage worker. This is someone who works full time at the grocery store or at McDonald's, and they will still be in this bottom 20% bracket. So it's really, we have to do more than talk about people pulling themselves up from their bootstraps, or we need to teach a man how to fish, not give him the fish. These are people who are doing fishing. We just aren't giving them enough money to survive in their life. And so what does this mean? When we break this up, it showcases how racism still plays in our taxation code. As you can see, if you're white in the state of Louisiana, on average, you're going to pay about 8.2% of your total income in taxes. But if you're Black, you're going to pay about 8.8%. And why is that? Because we know Louisiana has one of the highest sales tax in the nation, and our state and local sales tax, which is what we used often to fund projects across the state. As you know, a few years ago, when it came down to solving the fiscal cliff, the governor and the legislator decided they were going to do it based off of using a sales tax. You can look at local governments when it's time for capital improvements, our infrastructure improvements, our school financing. What is the one thing they normally do? It's not property taxes. It's normally they pass a sales tax. And so we know, because sales tax hit the poorest Louisianians harder, and we know more Black individuals in the state are living in poverty, they're going to pay a greater share of their income in taxes based off of the way we have structured our system. And so when we kind of think of the bigger picture, this means that our tax system just isn't helping in inequities and inequalities in our state. White families have significantly more income on average than any other Louisianians. And then after taxes, that disparity increases. So what you can see is the light blue is what your percent of your income on average would be before taxes, and then what is it after taxes. And so as you can see, white families actually gain in income after their state and local taxes is accounted for, while Black families and our indigenous individuals and our Hispanic families actually lose their share of income after taxes. So our system is actually benefiting whiter families more than it is people of color in our state. So how can this be? So one of the things you're going to see is that, as Susan mentioned, this legislative session is a tax session. It's called a fiscal session, which means our lawmakers have 5 bills that they can focus on that are not tax related. And then they can do a lot of things that are tax related. So this makes the conversations very complex when we have recessions, because we can only deal with our revenue stream every other year. And that's why you kind of have seen in the last few years a bunch of special sessions. So one of the reasons why we see those racial disparities is really because we have some very crazy deductions that exist in our tax code right now. So this is what we call the federal income tax deduction. And so what does this mean? Louisiana is one of 6 states in the nation that allows for a federal income tax deduction. And so what does that mean? That means people can deduct what they paid in federal taxes off of their state taxes. Now, as you can see, out of those 6 states, we're one of 2 that doesn't have a cap. So that means as the economic factors change, so does our revenue stream. So for instance, we ended up actually making some money last year because of the Trump tax cuts. When President Trump passed the Jobs and Tax Cut Act, he actually cut federal taxes for more wealthier people, which means because he did that, there was less money that they could deduct from their state taxes, which is why we actually saw about 600. We saw some surplus. We about saw $600,000, 600 million, money come back into the state coffers because they were paying less in federal taxes, which means there was less they can deduct in their state taxes. But we know there was conversations going on in Washington, D.C. right now and under the Biden administration about increasing federal taxes, especially about those families making over $400,000 a year, which means if that happens and D.C. raises federal taxes, we will start to see less revenue in the state because people will be able to deduct that increase in their federal taxes on their state taxes. This policy has shown that it has absolutely no economic value for anything in the state. It does not produce more jobs. It does not create a more sustainable community. And we have seen people on the left and on the right of the political spectrum call this deduction just simply wild because it makes absolutely no economic sense. And so as you can see, the only 2 states who have no cap whatsoever on this deduction is Louisiana and Alabama. And I think that tells us a lot about why this structure of the tax system just should not exist. So what does the Fed deduction actually mean? And as you can see, it is very expensive in our state. As you can see in 2016, this deduction was costing our state over almost closely to $1 billion simply off of just individual tax returns, not even when you add the corporate. Now, as you can see, as I mentioned, in 2020, it's costing us significantly less. And that is because of the corporate and individual tax cuts that the president made in 2018, 2017. And so you're starting to see the effect of people not being able to deduct as much as I mentioned in the last slide. But the moment federal, corporate, and income taxes go up, you're going to start to see the state losing over $1 billion again, simply because of this one deduction. So when Susan was mentioning about what we could do and how much money it needed to fund childcare, and we're talking about $86 million for childcare, and we're talking about money for food security. Here we go. And we can't find it right here alone. In 2016, that was $1 billion, $1 billion plus and some change right there. So we know that we have the revenue, we have the resources to do the work that we need to do to fund our children. The question is, will the legislature and the governor have the willpower to make some of these changes to be able to put money back in the state's budget so we can provide for the least of these in our state? And so I'm not going to go along on this slide, but basically what does this show? It just shows who really benefits from this tax break. As you can see, if you're in the top 1% making over $500,000, you're getting about $14,500 back off of your state taxes that you owe to the state, simply off of what you paid in federal taxes. And so there's really no benefit for lower income families, because as you can see, if you're in that minimum wage, low 20% bracket, you're only getting about $13 back from this tax break, while the rich families are getting close to $15,000 back. So, as we enter in the next 3 weeks, you're going to hear a lot about in the media about tax reform, that we need to simplify the Louisiana tax code, make it fairer so we can be competitive and we can attract businesses and do more here. And what's the problem with this? You're going to hear a lot about, let's have a rate reduction. Let's have a rate reduction for our income taxes and make it fair and simplified. And almost sometimes you may even hear a conversation about a flat tax, making it where everyone's paying the exact same percent. Or you may even hear, while it's not as popular among some on the right, it is growing, about completely eliminating Louisiana's income taxes. And then all of a sudden we will be a prosperous state. The problem with this plan is, as I mentioned, the right and the left both agree that we should get rid of the Fed deduction. But the plan that we're hearing is to get rid of the Fed deduction and recoup that $880 million. And instead of using it to invest in children, we would use that to give another tax break for the wealthy. Because if we lower a flat rate and make our income tax flat, you remember the wealthy will still pay less in taxes than the bottom 20%. The other problem with this tax plan that we're hearing in reform is that it still leaves the clean penny for renewal in 25. So as we know, a few years ago, we had the budget shortfall and the fiscal cliff, and the legislator agreed to renew 0.45 of the penny sales tax. But they put an expiration date on that, and it expires on June 30th, 2025, which means in just 4 more years, the state's going to be out of $500 million, a half $500 million that we're going to have to figure out where that revenue comes from. So we still have tax reform that needs to be done, because we have a big issue coming on the horizon in about 4 years. The other issue is this might not be revenue neutral. We keep hearing that. We've heard the governor say it, the legislator, that anything that they do this session, they want to be revenue neutral. So if they cut taxes, they want to make sure they raise taxes somewhere else so that there is a net zero effect on the state budget. However, we know the plan on changing income brackets is not revenue neutral. It won't be, because of the way how we know deductions and exemptions work in this state and the changing effects of federal taxation policy, which means revenue neutral cannot be good. It is not good enough. If we really want to invest in our children and we want to have an equitable future for all, we have to start talking about how do we raise adequate revenue to provide the goods and the services that we need for the people of Louisiana. So, as I mentioned earlier, this is just kind of a little bit more information on the clean penny and what that actually means, and why we need to have those conversations this legislative session, especially if we're talking about income inequality, and why we see that big gap between Black and white families in the amount of taxes that they pay in the state of Louisiana. So we have a better idea for tax reform. What should that mean? We agree. Let's eliminate the Fed deduction for individuals and corporations. This year, the estimates would bring $831 million back into the state. We also believe that it's time, let's go ahead and roll off the clean penny. Let's use dedicated funds right now from the federal deduction to supplement that $500 million and actually start to make our tax code more fair and equitable to every person. But lastly, we think we should really take this moment and invest in children and families by strengthening our earned income tax credit. Susan will tell you, Susan and I, about 3 years ago, were running around the Capitol late into the night trying to find every person that we could to vote for the EITC. And I think I only survived because Susan gave me the best candy I've ever had, which was some cantaloupe Kit Kats from overseas. But we only were able to raise that from 3%, 3.5% of the federal credit to 5%. We proposed, let's up that to 10% of the federal credit, and let's eliminate the sunset that is going to happen, which would have been in 2025. And we're proud to say Representative Ted James will be authoring both of those bills this legislative session. We also believe that we know that in the early ages of the coronavirus, that dependents, people who are 18 to 24, some of the most food insecure individuals, weren't able to get the earned income tax credit because they had no children. So we are also going to propose, and thanks to Representative Jason Hughes of New Orleans, we'll propose bringing a short-term EITC expansion to childless adults, those people in 18 to 24 who are working as our essential workers, but may have still been a dependent on their parents' taxes, so they didn't get any of the first 2 stimulus checks. And lastly, we know investing in early childhood education is important, but we need to cut child poverty. We are so proud of what the American Recovery Plan does with its child tax credit, but that's only a year. It's only temporary. So Louisiana can step up and we can create our own, which we are calling the Strong Families Tax Credit, that will supplement and expand what the Biden administration and the American Recovery Plan does. So what do we know? We know child poverty is extremely expensive. And it charges interest. I like to say poverty charges interest. I wear a mask all the time in the Capitol that says that, because I want to remind people that when we're talking about poverty, we cannot talk about it solely as if people just happen. We know the poorer you are, making ends meet becomes very taxing. And it's like you have an interest charge just because you live in poverty. The National Academy of Sciences has predicted that the United States child poverty costs us anywhere between $800 billion to $1 trillion every single year. So we know if we start to provide supplemental income to families, we could start to reduce child poverty in half. We can boost test scores. We can increase years of school attendance and improve the mental and physical health of our young people. Also, this would increase the wages and the earnings of young people as they become adults, which could really change our economic factors here in the state of Louisiana. So our proposal that we are honored that Representative Matt Willard of New Orleans will be carrying forth this session is to provide a child tax credit for families making under $100,000 a year. Now that may seem like a lot, but I want to make mention that that covers 80% of all Louisiana families. Even if we lowered it down to $55,000 as our income eligibility cap, that would cover 94% of those 80% of the Louisiana families. So we know that this would benefit a lot of people. And so we propose giving $500 to every child under the age of 5 if a family is making under $50,000 a year, and $300 for families in that $50,000 to $100,000 a year. And then also we need to support our young growing adults as well and our adolescents. And so we are asking to give $300 per child, and then $200 if you're in that income bracket. This proposal would only cost us $165 million. So when we talk about the Fed deduction, remember, that was $831 million. This proposal, which would help us cut child poverty in half, only cost the state $165 million. So we have the resources to really do the work to provide extra income for our families. Because we know that tax credits and social safety net programs are the best reduction in child poverty. What this shows is just how beneficial the CTC and EITC are in curbing child poverty, that we can cut child poverty almost by 6% just with these programs alone. And that's before you talk about food access. That's before you talk about their caregivers and their grandparents getting Social Security and housing subsidies. So we know if we really want to reduce child poverty, the way to do that is to invest in safety net programs that uplift children and uplift their families. So we know that we're going to have an influx of money. And we know that the governor released his budget about a few weeks ago and outlined his priorities. And he had to release it not accounting for the federal money that I'm going to explain in a second that we got. But we know there's a lot of unfunded priorities that we have in Louisiana. We know we need to do better for our teachers and support staffs, and that they're still about $4,000 below the Southern Regional Educational Board's average, and that our support staff is even lower in our region. We know early childhood education needs about $86 million. We know that the GO Grant program, which often doesn't get talked about because of TOPS, but which is what provides need-based aid to Louisiana's families, needs about $135 million to be fully funded. We've only been giving this program roughly around $30 million every single year. Susan talked about housing. The Housing Trust Fund has received $25 million in 2007 to provide affordable housing across Louisiana and has received not a single penny since then. So we're going nearly 14 years without putting any money in the trust fund for housing security. And we know home and community health-based centers services have had an extraordinarily long wait list because we haven't had the funds to provide what they need to do this. Yes, I just see somebody talked about DCFS also needs more money for attorneys for adoption from foster care. Yes, we have a lot of unfunded priorities in this state. And what this presentation that we've been trying to present today is to showcase to you is that we don't have to be all trying to cut up the same small slice of pie. We have the resources to make the pie bigger, to give every person a bigger slice. We just need our legislator to actually do real reform for taxes and raise revenue that can provide adequate funding so we can fund all of these priorities instead of all fighting over small pieces of the pie. So what can we do? We only talked about Fed deduction and we talked about the earned income tax credits, but there is a lot more that can be done when in terms of adding revenue to our state. So we know sports betting will be a conversation, and we don't know the predictions, but we've seen from other states how much money that has raised. There are conversations about legalizing cannabis and taxing it. We ran some models. If Louisiana did that and based it off of the Washington model of taxation, we would raise an additional $137 million for the state. We can reinstate the inheritance and estate tax. In 2012, Governor Jindal repealed the inheritance tax. So basically what this means, we would raise $90 million alone just off of putting a tax on inheritance that equal over $1 million. Let me remind you of that. We raised $90 million off of inheritance, of taxing inheritance that people receive at $1 million, at $1 million. Our average household income is $50,000. So we're not talking about hitting the vast majority of Louisianians. We're talking about the richest of the rich in our state. We can do some other tax reforms like combined reporting, eliminating excise itemized deductions, and then scaling back some of those tax incentives that have proved to be costly and not actually provided enough resources for our people, like the movie tax credit and the quality jobs program. So that's how we can raise money. But we're going to hear a lot of people say what I just said on the last slide shouldn't happen because of what's happening on this slide, which is what the American Rescue Plan did. The American Rescue Plan is going to give Louisiana $5.2 billion of additional resources that we can utilize. As you can see, $3 billion of it is going to go to our state government. $572 million of it went to our metropolitan cities, so New Orleans, Shreveport, Lafayette, Lake Charles, Opelousas, Monroe, and Alexandria. We'll see some of this money. Other municipalities, so those are some of your smaller cities, will have a pool of about $322 million. Unlike the CARES Act, the American Rescue Plan actually gives every parish a piece of federal financing. So we will see our parishes receive about $902 million. Each will get some, but the bigger you are, the more money you will get. And then capital projects and improvements will see about $180 million of additional revenue that they can utilize. So that's going to equal our $5.2 billion of money. One of the things that's not talked about is all of this money does not have to be spent in this legislative session or in this fiscal year. The federal guidelines say that we must spend all of the money by January 1st of 2025, which why does that ring a bell? Remember, in 2025 is when we're going to enter our fiscal cliff. So we could really do some serious tax reform and raise that adequate revenue and utilize this. We can use this money to mitigate budget shortfalls. So if we have some cuts in our state budget, we can plug in some of the holes with this. But one of the provisions that is the most important is that we cannot use any of this $5.2 billion to supplement a single tax cut. Now, the great thing about this is earned income tax credit and child tax credits are not counted as tax cuts. They are counted as revenue expenditures, which means we could use federal money to fund a CTC or an AITC expansion in the state of Louisiana, but we cannot reduce the federal we cannot reduce corporate income taxes or individual income taxes and then try to plug in this money from the federal government. So that's something we have to take in mind. So we'll be looking out for that. But when we talk about that federal money, we can actually be creative. This federal guidelines allows us to institute some of that existing money and create new programs. We're seeing states think about for every family that receives SNAP benefits, that they could receive an additional $300 of just cash assistance. We can move along this other states that are going to be using some of this federal money to give essential workers a pay increase. The provisions allow us to give them what would we call emergency funds and give them up to $13 an hour, up to $25,000 in additional to what they're going to be making to help move them above the poverty line. So we can do a lot of creative things with the very well intended social safety net programs that we have done. And when we talk about social safety net programs, what we have done at the Louisiana Budget Project is we've taken our time to really try to educate the members of the legislature of how much food assistance, Medicaid expansion, TANF, and working tax credits actually benefits their constituents. So we have what we call district fact sheets. And we've created these that basically showcase all of the social safety net programs in our state and how many individuals within that legislative district are receiving them. So you can go to our website and you can look up your own legislative district and you can find out demographic information, the economic status of your district, as well as the economic security when it comes to our social safety net programs and how much they mean. So we can have true conversations with members of the legislature about how these programs benefit their constituents, not just the state in general. So what else can you do? To keep up with us, we are, like Susan said, it's going to be a very busy session and we're going to be putting out a lot. I can tell you in the next few weeks, we're going to be distributing, looking at workforce dollars and how that connect to childcare. We're going to be talking in depth about our tax structure and who pays. We're going to have a 2-pager on the federal deduction. We just published about how, if you want to know more about the American Rescue Plan and the provisions in those, we've just published that last week. So you can subscribe on our website to the Daily Dime, which produces a daily kind of newsletter about programs and initiatives that are happening across the nation. You can also go to our website where we have all of the information I just listed, but also those district fact sheets and those reports that I mentioned. And you can follow us on our social media at LA Budget Project, where we engage on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. So that's how you can stay in contact with us. And I want to thank you so much for taking time to listen to our presentation and for Susan bringing us a part of this journey.
Thank you so much, Devontae. I appreciate your time and this great presentation from the Budget Project. We have some time now to open it up for questions. We have both the Q&A link, or you can use the chat link to post your questions, and we'd be happy to take those now. Okay, I don't see any questions or anything in the chat. If there aren't any points for conversation, oh, there's a Q&A. Do you know of any movement to cut taxes? Devontae, you have a little bit more ear on the ground on this one. Would you like to take it?
Yeah, so the big movement has been on a flat tax, which would be lowering the income tax bracket for most of our wealthiest individuals. Xi Jinping actually filed a bill last night. So I want to say that's House Bill 168, if I'm not mistaken. So we're going to review that, which would probably bring our wealthier individuals that are paying about 6% in 6% of their income in personal income taxes. And I believe his proposal, if I read it correctly last night, is moving that down to 4%. We're also going to see a lot of some of those same exemptions. We've seen Representative Phil DeVilliers file those for our oil and gas industry by giving them tax breaks. So those will be part of the conversation. But we have had conversations with Chairman Alon and Chairman Bishop, the two chairs of the tax committees in the Senate and the House, and they are claiming revenue neutral. But the challenge that I want to warn everybody, what we're going to see in the Legislative Fiscal Office is talking about, is that they're going to use what is called an economic theory called dynamic scoring. So they are bringing in their own economists to score to do an analysis on their bill using dynamic scoring. And dynamic scoring is this theory of tax credits actually produce economic benefits that are not seen. So what they try to do, and you've seen this in DC a lot, and this was kind of the model of trickle-down economics, where when I cut taxes, you have to account for what I think the growth in spending and the growth in our capital will be. And because normal fiscal analysis don't take that into account, because it's very shaky and it's hard to measure if I do a tax cut, a personal income tax cut, does that mean people actually go shop more? You can't really say that. So you're going to see those conversations of tax cuts, but you're going to see them in a different way where they're saying it's revenue neutral because they're going to be using dynamic scoring, saying, well, when I cut personal income taxes, the rich are going to go buy more goods and services, which means they'll pay more in sales tax so that we'll make up that money. We know that's not going to be the case. So that's where you're going to see a lot of the conversation, but we're going to be publishing something so you can understand why dynamic scoring is faulty, and we should not take anyone using dynamic scoring as a way to say something's revenue neutral.
Right. Another question from Rob Gorman, would that be disallowed under the stimulus bill, even with the dynamic scoring illusion?
It would be. I think we're all going to be waiting on Treasury guidelines. I think one of the things you've already heard the governor and members of the legislature talk about is replenishing the unemployment trust fund with some of this money. And there are some serious questions that we've asked about that, because as you know, the legislature last session suspended a tax increase for businesses that happen when the unemployment trust fund gets below its measure. So replenishing the trust fund with federal dollars would actually be preventing a tax increase. So it would be a tax cut. So there's some waffly decisions about whether or not some of the provisions that are already talking about will count. I think everybody is just waiting for the Treasury Department to release their guidance on what can and cannot be used. But like I said, earned income tax credit, child tax credit will be counted as spending. So they will not be subjected to that tax cut, even though they are technically a tax break on income. But I think some of these provisions, even with dynamic scoring, will still count as a tax cut no matter what they say if it's actually raising revenue. In theory, it is a tax cut, which means it violates the provision of the law, which is very explicit in the American Rescue Plan.
All right, well, are there any other questions? Okay, well, as the weather is coming through here in Baton Rouge, we really hope that everyone stays safe from their respective locations today as the inclement weather hits hits us once again. Thank you so much for joining us today. And again, please visit our website for the links, and we will continue to have information ahead of the 2021 legislative session. So thank you all for your time today, and we look forward to staying in touch with you throughout the session.